Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Kahrl Molden. I'm a first year studying government and classics at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the street side. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit close to you and congregate in the JFK Jr. Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Harvard College senior Arthur Christie Domersant.
Hi y'all, and welcome again to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Arthur Christie Domersant. I'm a senior here at Harvard College, and I study government and global health and health policy. Tonight's forum is the first in a collaborative series between the Institute of Politics and the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project that highlights works at the intersection of art, sports, entertainment, and racial justice. Before I matriculated at Harvard College, I lived in a small town right outside of West Palm Beach, Florida, named Okeechobee, where cows outnumbered people 4-1. And before I spent my days learning about the drivers of political institutions and social inequities, I spent my days driving tractors in my agricultural education courses. For me, there was something so meaningful, so fulfilling about cultivating the land. And I'm not unique in knowing that there's a lot of benefits to cultivating the land. For generations and generations, Black, brown, and indigenous folks have spent their time building the practices that are now fundamental to American agriculture. But due to the legacies of slavery, sharecropping, and forced displacement from ancestral lands, those same populations have been driven out of the practices that have made American agriculture. Today, only 2% of farmers in the United States identify as Black, and perhaps even more strikingly, over $320 billion worth of land has been lost due to land succession titles discrepancies. And in the wake of this country's reckoning with race during the COVID-19 pandemic, and alongside the ongoing injustices that have plagued American agriculture since its inception, John Deere and Al Roker Entertainment teamed up to produce a documentary entitled Gaining Ground: The Fight for Black Land. Directed by Eternal Polk, the film explores the causes, the effects, and the solutions to the dearth of Black agriculturalists and Black land loss. The film has been super successful on the summer film circuit, amassing wins at Essence, Martha's Vineyard, and Tribeca Film Festivals, amongst many, many others. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from the minds and the hearts that were fundamental to the production of this film. Philip P.J. Haynie is a fifth-generation farmer who owns and operates Haynie Farms, LLC, a grain farming business spanning all 4 counties of the northern neck of Virginia. Haynie and his family also own and operate a variety of other successful businesses as well. He currently serves as the chairman of the National Black Growers Council, and he graduated from Virginia Tech with his bachelor's degree in agricultural and applied economics, and he is a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Johane J is the Global Human Resources Director, whose portfolio spans Chief Financial Officer, Chief People Officer functions, People Transformation and Strategy, and HR Compliance and Policies at John Deere, the world's largest agricultural and construction equipment manufacturer, and the key contributor to the creation of Gaining Ground. A graduate of Michigan State University School of Law, she previously oversaw talent supply, onboarding, and diversity, equity, and inclusion at Deere & Company. Our next panelist is Eternal Polk, who is a 2-time Emmy-nominated director, writer, and segment producer with over 20 years of working on short and long-form projects, including documentaries, music videos, branded content, and commercials. Polk graduated from New York University with his bachelor's in fine arts. The conversation tonight will be moderated by Dr. Andrew Kahrl. Dr. Kahrl is a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Virginia. His research focuses on the social, political, and environmental history of real estate, land use, and taxation in the 20th century. In addition to his incredible scholarship, Dr. Kahrl's latest book, entitled The Black Tax: 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America, is set to be released in the spring of 2024. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel and moderator to the forum stage.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming here tonight, and thank you for the panelists to discuss this really important film that is really a film about one of the most important struggles in African American history, the struggle for land. You know, black people never got their 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War, but on their own, African Americans accumulated between 16 and 20 million acres of land in the 50 years following emancipation. By the early 1900s, 1 out of every 4 black people working in agriculture owned and farmed the land under their feet. In some states, 1 out of 2. And this was at a time when white plantation owners and white-controlled institutions across the South were doing everything in their power to keep black farmers in permanent indebtedness as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So this land was a remarkable achievement, one that was won against the greatest of odds, which really makes the loss of that land over the course of the 20th century and still today even more alarming. You know, trillions of dollars of generational wealth have been lost through land dispossession, and these losses have played no small role in fueling the racial wealth gap, the widest of all measures of racial inequality in America today. And this film really tells how this happened and why it matters. And it tells the stories of the people and organizations and companies that are working today to arrest those losses and to protect and expand black people's land holdings and empower future generations of farmers. So I want to begin really by thanking each of you for the work you're doing to draw attention to this history and to this struggle. And I think, again, this film, it's incredibly powerful if you haven't had a chance to see it already. And I think it really captures the meaning and significance of this story and its relevance to today. So I wanted to start with a question for you, Eternal, the filmmaker. You know, why did you decide to do a film on the fight for black land, and how did you get involved in this work?
Well, thank you for that question. And as I say, this film came to me. This project came to me. I have to always announce and say the name of Denise Hurst Green. She is a former colleague of mine who is now with Al Roker Entertainment. She saw an article about the LEAP Coalition and the work they were doing to help landowners and farmers get clear title to the land. And she reached out to John Deere and said, I think you have a story here. Her background is 20 plus years at NFL Films, that's where we met. And so she knows storytelling when she sees it, and she knows a story. And when she reached out, it was because she knew that there was a story in how John Deere was doing this work and the story of the people behind it, the people who were being helped, the people who were in these positions. She casually mentioned this idea to me and the story to me when we were talking about something else. And I said, wait a minute, that's a good idea. I would love to work on that. And after months of us having conversations and me asking, hey, what's going on with that project? Did you ever get the director? She says, yeah, we're working on it. And then like 5 months later, I get a phone call and said, how would you like to work on this project? And I'm like, you know I want to work on this project because I've been talking about it every time we get on the phone. My own background, and I think I've shared with it, is I was on a thread of men who were, we were having conversations during the pandemic when we were all kind of shut in, and that was how we were kind of keeping in touch. And one of the people on the thread had mentioned that they had land in their family since the late 1800s, which was like shocking to me. And so it really kind of put that idea in my head, oh wow, we need to talk about this. Like black folks having land from the late 1800s, hundreds of acres. At that time, I thought that was a lot until I met people like PJ, and then you start hearing 10,000 and 12,000 acres of land. But it really, really just kind of stuck with me. And when at the time I was working with a marketing agency that was doing a lot of work with BET, and everyone was coming to that organization and saying, how can we get this message out? What messages should we tell? And I kept pitching black farmers. And it was 2 years later when I was able to helm this project. So we kind of, met together, and that's how I got to be a part of it.
So Joe, I imagine it's not every day that a company like John Deere gets involved in producing a film. So tell me about sort of why John Deere became involved in this and some of the work that you've done through this.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a great question. Maybe I'll just take a step back to talk about why we even got involved in the creation of the LEAP Coalition to begin with. It really all got culminated with the aftermath of the senseless murders of, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then, George Floyd. And there were countless organizations that, wanted to go in and sort of put, funding behind, how you go around as an organization and try as best you can to shore down discriminatory practices around the country. But Deere had a completely different philosophy at the time. And I would be remiss if I did not talk about the chief architect of the LEAP Coalition at Deere, Mark Howes, who's our senior advisor to the chairman and CEO of the organization. And he coined this term, a black man as well, I want to be very clear on this. And he coined this term very early on when there was a lot of discussion around what is it that Deere needs to do? How does Deere show up? And his moniker was, social justice without economic justice is just chit chat. So there probably have been many of you who have seen the film, and for those of you who hopefully will see it later, you will hear him talk about the critical importance of making sure that we are, to your point, we are listening and doing our part to reduce the wealth gap that's been plaguing the Black communities for a very long time. And the second piece is, John Deere is a global leader in agriculture, right? This is the space where we provide manufacturing excellence and technology excellence in this space. So heirs property became a really critical area where we had credibility to be able to really do something about it. And hence came in sort of the creation of the LEAP Coalition with one of the other architects, Collis Jones, who's our VP of Public Affairs, who's here with us tonight, who worked with Mark and several other leaders internally, and then worked with other organizations like the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, the National Black Growers Council, where PJ is chair of it, to really come up with a construct around the LEAP Coalition. And with that, it became really important for us to determine, how do we expand the work that needs to be done to reduce that wealth gap? How do we go about ensuring that others across the country understand the issues of heirs property? And there came our partnering and engagement with Al Roker Entertainment and with Eternal to really tell the meaningful stories of how those atrocities can be eliminated and or reduced if we work together collectively in helping in a very, very meaningful way, and we can talk about that later, the organizations that seek to eradicate heirs property every single day. So that's really what, how, that was sort of the critical, impetus for us jumping into this work, and then really, really leveraging the powerful art of storytelling, so beautifully done by Eternal, to really raise this as a critical point around our nation for how we get to eliminate that wealth gap. Because as Mark said, social justice without economic justice is really just chit chat.
Yeah. So PJ, this film really tells your story and your experiences as a farmer. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into farming and how it led you to join this fight for Black land?
Yes. Well, I tell people farming is an industry you're born into it or you marry into it. The barrier of entry is very high. And fortunately for me, I was born into farming. I'm a 5th generation Black farmer. And I'm fortunate that my great-great-grandfather was the first African American to come out of slavery and purchased 60 acres of land on September 14, 1867 in Northumberland County, Virginia. And by the grace of God, my family still owns that land, and we operate that today, and we've grown beyond that. Growing up as a young black kid driving tractors in rural America, I had a front row seat at inequity in agriculture. I witnessed it every day at the parts store, at the hardware store, at the fertilizer co-op, and I saw that. And as I grew in my career in agriculture, at college, and on a professional level, I realized that the diversity in the hands that grow the food is not as diverse as the knees that are under the table that consume the food that we grow. And we got to shuffle this deck. The one thing that everybody in this room had to do today, regardless of your age, race, religion, or political affiliation, we all had to eat. There is no culture without agriculture. Food is the one thing that connects us all. So I have been there and see this, and I realized that as a kid going to college, I didn't see other young kids that looked like me that were going back to their family farms. Most people wanted to go careers in corporate America, worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I was one of very few pickup driving, boot wearing kids in college that wanted to go back to that farm. And the light really didn't come on for me until about 2010, when I had the pleasure of meeting other black farmers. And I was invited to a meeting. I laughed. I said, well, I don't know any other black farmers that are doing what I'm doing, so I'm happy to come to this meeting. And when the gentleman said, well, PJ, there are going to be farmers here your size and larger, I stopped the tractor in the middle of the field. I thought he was lying. And when I met 11 other black farmers that were spread out in very rural areas and isolated on islands like I was, we all had something in common. And we started a nonprofit organization to address that issue. And that organization is the National Black Growers Council.
So let's talk about some of the issues that the film raises, in particular heirs property that you mentioned a moment ago, Joe. Can you explain for the audience what heirs property is and why it has been such a problem for African American farmers in America?
Sure. I'll talk about maybe the mechanics of it, and then perhaps ask PJ to really talk about what that lived experience property looks like. So heirs property is essentially property that is owned by descendants of someone who did not have clear legal will to the land. And therefore, what that really means is that that person does not have clear title, which means their descendants do not have clear title to the land. And then what ends up happening is that the property or the land gets passed down from generation to generations. And as you can imagine, right, so your heirs grow over time, and each heir to that piece of land that does not have clear title to it now own fractional ownership of that land. And with that, if you have fractional ownership, you have the ability to to parcel the land, you have the ability to force a sale onto the land. And so from generation to generation, without having that access to that clear title, you can actually have your property sold to another party, a fractional ownership, and then therefore it forces the sale of the land, and then you lose that over time. So that's really what has plagued Black communities, not just Black communities, but for purposes of this discussion, an incredible amount of Black landowners over the last century. And as a result of that involuntary land loss, as we call it, that type of farmland has dwindled from 16 to 19 million acres to now, I believe, less than 2 million acres today over the course of 100 years. And a lot of that loss, obviously has to do with this lack of clear title, but it also has to do with violence against Black communities, Black landowners and farmers who had to flee their land over time to and have and that piece of land has been lost. So that's sort of the mechanics behind what heirs property is about. And then I don't know if PJ wants to give maybe some actual color into how it still plays us today.
How have you seen this play out in your
Well, when you think about post-slavery and sharecropping, African Americans, in 1920 owned, like Joe said, 16 million acres of land. And with, limited education and not really trusting in lawyers and other people, we didn't really have the education and know-how. So people did what they were taught to do, just left it unattended. And as we saw this displacement, as people have moved from the South and migrated north for jobs and opportunity, they still held on to that land, but because of trust factors and concerns, they didn't take that land to a lawyer. People were very protective of what they had, and they didn't share their cards openly with everyone. Well, what they found is that, as the parents die and they have 5 children, that land is left to 5 children, and then those children have 10 children, you ended up with 50 people in one piece of property and no really control. And that was a tool that was used to negate opportunity for those families, okay? And that's where we saw this demise. Andrew, it's not that black farmers didn't have the know-how to farm, because we came over as slaves and we farmed the land. And it's not because it rained on the white farmer's side of the road and it didn't rain on the black farmer's side of the road that we saw this genocide of black farmers and this massive loss of land. It was because of tools in the toolbox and access to opportunities that our neighbors had that black farmers didn't have. Access to lower interest levels, access to fertilizer and seed and credit on time. Farming is a very timely business. If you don't plant on time, you don't harvest on time. And through all of this, we've seen that purposely, and even going back to the whole black farmer lawsuit, studies have shown that even with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the class action lawsuit where the Department of Agriculture admitted to discriminating against black farmers in their lending practices. Farmers would go in the spring to apply for their loans. You go in and apply for your loan in February, hope to have your loan in March. It's time to plant, mid-March, early April, and go to the field. Well, if your loan didn't get approved until June, you've missed your window. All the neighbor's corn is chest high, and you just go to the field, and what happens is your crop succumbs to the dog days of summer. Your corn is pollinating during the heat of August. At harvest time, the neighbors are harvesting 200 bushel corn. You're harvesting 100. 100 bushels won't repay your loan to the government, and they knew that on purpose. When you couldn't pay your debts, foreclosure signs stuck in your front yard. That was the domino effect that happened across the South, and that was one of the leading traits to why.
And the film really, goes into detail, Eternal, talking about the Pigford decision, this, class action lawsuit against the USDA, capturing this sort of longer history. And I think one of the things I found was so beautiful about the film and so powerful is how it weaves together this history along with the lived experiences of people today. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you decided and how you sort of structured this film to really capture both this long story of land ownership as well as a kind of living legacy today amongst, not just PJ, but many other farmers who you spoke with and met.
Well, I start off with a very simple premise. I don't want it to be boring. So I know from, film school, I'm in film school, I may have watched 100 documentaries, some better than others, some more interesting and engaging than others. And I always kind of credit the time I spent at NFL Films because that's where I really sort of, honed in on how to really tell stories. Because, football is football, like if you don't watch football and you don't love the game itself, there are interesting people behind the stories, behind the teams, behind the people. So, it was really leaning back on that and understanding that you can tell an engaging story like this if you really focus on the people. Issues are issues, right? It doesn't matter if it's a housing issue, if it's a farming issue. The real meat of any story are the people. There are so many different ways people come to their point in life. You know, PJ is fifth generation. The Eli family, 15 kids, and they got the land from a tenant loan, purchase tenant loan. So when you get into those sort of stories and you get into the people behind the issue, that's when it gets really interesting and engaging. But as somebody who did not know about heirs property before I came to this, I knew that I put myself in the position of the audience. Like, I want to answer the questions that I had, you know? And I knew that the balance of those things, I really wanted this to be almost a definitive piece that if you saw this, you understood the people who were behind it, the different types of people. You know, that's why we had like Karen Washington, an urban farmer who started off in abandoned lots in New York City. And she started that, and then she transitioned to actual 6 acres of land upstate New York. For people who are from New York, don't kill me because I called an hour outside the city upstate. But you know, those people and their stories, and then the information, because I was so curious, how did we get land, that much land? Because this was new to me as an older person, I won't say the age, but how did we lose the land? What were the dynamics of things going on? There are things that we understood, and this is why history is important. There was this understanding that, you know, we were enslaved, we were let go, we didn't get 40 acres and a mule, and we didn't have land. I found that out to be wrong very, very quickly, but also that one of the biggest issues was the former landowners, the plantation owners, they couldn't afford the land. They had to do something. And so the people who were there who could, you know, hey, we'll sell it to you, we'll work out an agreement where you work the land and all this other stuff. So there was a clear reason how this land got into Black folks' hands. But when you talk about Reconstruction, it was like, okay, it was basically like, okay, we're going to get out of our issue and problem by, you know, giving it to you. But then a couple years later, then it's like, okay, we want it back. We want everything back, whether it's the land, whether it's the gains you've made in society and different communities and towns and all this other stuff. So there was my curiosity, but there was also the desire to show people like PJ in the space so that it seems real and not history, like a story that's happened, but that isn't currently happening, because it is currently happening as well.
Yeah, it really comes through as well how this is, you know, the land is not just simply a means of making a living, but this is, you know, really integral to communities, to families' identities. You know, these are places where ancestors are buried, where family reunions happen. You know, PJ, could you maybe say a little bit, you know, more about just the sort of importance of land in the Black rural communities that you're a part of, and how this, you know, what happens when this is lost? I mean, and I think, you know, that's something that, you know, it goes beyond just even this sort of wealth.
Yeah, when it's lost, you'd never get it back. And that's the thing, you know, when you think about land, it's where a lot of memories are. You know, I was listening to a country song, and the guy was telling him about somebody wanted to come and buy the farm, and this guy's like, this dirt ain't cheap. My dog's buried over there. I proposed to my wife over there, and my daughter used to swing under that tree as a kid, and you can't get those memories back. And it's no similar to you raising your family on the land, walking down to the pond fishing, riding your four-wheelers across the land, hunting. You know, having the gift to raise your family in a way that you want to, versus being forced in a concrete and asphalt jungle with sirens and stoplights everywhere. You know, it's a choice versus a want. And I think that's where a lot of people were taken away from that ability to raise their families. You know, rural America is a good place to raise your family. Now, there are a lot of things that it doesn't have, but quiet and serenity and peace of mind is one. And when you're forced off of that and you don't have that anymore, you don't have any choice. And, you know, a story I was telling you earlier about, if you had the ability to live and raise your family in a rural area on the land, and they know that granddaddy plowed those same fields and great granddaddy walked behind a mule in those same fields. And now you just take them off of that and force them in a city or urban area where they have no freedom, they have no open space, and you're constricted to a lot more crime and violence. You can't monetize or put a value on that quality of life, Andrew. You can't do it. And that's what a lot of people miss out in the whole understanding of the value of land.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the important work that's being done now to protect black land and to empower black farmers. So Joe, can you talk about, you mentioned earlier the LEAP Coalition to help black farmers handle land issues, notably heirs property. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that LEAP does?
Sure. So LEAP is actually an acronym, and it stands for Legislation, Education, Advocacy, and Production System. So, Deere along with its partners were very intentional about making sure that we're creating this virtuous ecosystem with various organizations having this common interest around, legislative work that needs to continue to be done, whether it's on the Hill, whether other legal reforms that need to be done to eradicate heirs property across the country, making sure that we're educating black farmers and black landowners around what their rights are. Because a lot of the times, they did not even know that they were going through heirs property issues or had experienced it, right? So making sure that we're putting a close eye on what are, from an educational and training component around the various ways that they really need to have deeper access, if you will, to wills and estate planning. From that perspective becomes a really, really critical component, and that we're continually leveraging and working with organizations that are advocating for those rights and really working directly with those farmers. So we have partnered with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the Center for Heirs Property Preservation, two wonderful organizations that have been fighting on the front lines, doing that work with countless of folks within the black communities. And then, something that's been incredibly important to us when we're talking about, reducing the wealth gap. Once you have proper estate planning and you now have clear title to your land, a lot of the times, black landowners don't know what to do with the land itself, right? So leveraging the power of the National Black Growers Council and the great work that we do on our end to help them understand how to leverage the land itself as a productive mechanism to really reduce the wealth gap. How do you derive economic value from leveraging the land? What is it that you do? Like, I'm not a farmer, but if I have 100 acres of land, what is it that I can leverage? What can I do? Because it does have economic value to be able to to help my family and generations to come. So that's really what LEAP has done, and we're very proud. I mean, LEAP has been around now 3 years, probably just about 3 years, and we've been very proud to be able to help several families around the communities to clear around 39 titles to land. And it seems like it's an easy feat, but it's a really difficult feat to be able to do so over the course of less than 5 years, and have done a lot of, have put in a lot of funding behind helping organizations to clear titles. Well over 300 to 400 wills and estate planning has been done. And then we've been funding fellowships for attorneys to actually work in those organizations over the course of multiple years, funding their salaries and their benefits so that they themselves can work with those black communities and really continue to put a shining light, but also advocating and defending their causes. And then the last thing that I would say, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it, and a very proud moment for me as a lawyer myself. We've brought in interns, so well over a dozen interns over the course of 3 years to work during the summer with those organizations to really continue to pursue the work. And those law students have come from Southern University Law Center, Thurgood Marshall Law School, and a couple others, the North Carolina Central University, HBCU law schools, to continue to deepen the work. So it's really, Black organizations, Black universities, Black folks also helping Black communities to really create this ecosystem.
Yeah, we meet a few of those students in the film, and it's just really inspiring to see the kind of network being built up through these organizations. So, PJ, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the National Black Growers Council. You mentioned them earlier, and your role in forming this and what the work that it does.
Yes, so the National Black Growers Council is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to improve the efficiency, productivity, and sustainability of Black row crop farmers. And we specifically focus on row crop producers because we are the smallest group of all Black farmers. Typically, if you had 100 Black farmers in this room, only 8 of those men and women would be commodity growers. And when I say commodity, I'm talking corn, cotton, soybeans, peanuts, wheat, rice, the crops that are grown on large scale on large acres. It's easy to be a suburbanite and have your house in the suburbs and after work you go home and you get away from your spouse and your kids and you go back to your greenhouse and play and have a good time, and on Saturday morning you load up your SUV, you put your hat on, you go to the farmer's market, and you are a Black farmer. But you got a different set of challenges that we do in rural America, where you're buying $4,000 to $5,000 an acre land, $800 a ton fertilizer, $300,000 tractors, and on and on and on. So we specify row crop because we are the smallest breed of all Black farmers, and we are a dying breed. And when it comes to row crop, we know that we have the ability in large acre settings to change economic numbers in our communities. The numbers don't lie. Black farmers have diminished from, I think that in 1920 there were 1 million Black farmers, and we're less than 40,000 now. And I don't see the crop looking too strong coming behind me either, ladies and gentlemen. So we got to figure out how to make farming sexy for the next generation. How do we get everybody excited? Because, hey, we all got to eat. So what do we have to do to make sure we can have the next crop of Black men and women in agriculture? And that's really the charge here. And that's why we're very fortunate for partnerships that John Deere and others have given the National Black Growers Council to help support our cause, Andrew.
Yeah, so Eternal, how do you see this film sort of contributing to those efforts, and what's the future for this film in terms of getting it out into the public?
Well, a lot of this is exposure. As I said, I didn't know about heirs property, and I think I'm pretty well read on some of the things that's happening, especially as it applies to Black folks and inequities. But, again, you use remiss a couple of times, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention people like Thomas Mitchell, who's in the audience, and he's in the film, who has done the work to change some of the laws to make it harder. Is it 23 states now? 23 states. One of the families in the film was affected by his work. This is what it takes. People have to understand, number one, it is still happening, and that's what I wanted to communicate. But there are people like Thomas that are out there who are advocating, that there are organizations like the National Black Growers Council who are, they deal with people with heirs property. People who have heirs property because they can't get loans and other restrictive measures on their property, they farm those lands for some of those people. So the exposure to the different facets, the different people who are in it. I want to say something, and this goes to what PJ was saying about the people who are coming behind it. I find it very interesting. When I was a kid, there were 4-H clubs. There were things that you could actually understand about being in farm life. But what I've kind of come to understand, like with my life with this project, is that there's a whole career, a whole bunch of careers that Black, brown, and some indigenous folks just aren't aware of because it isn't presented. They're not going to be lawyers, doctors, dentists, or even filmmakers. They're not going to do that. And there's a whole area of life that they could be have careers in, and careers that are sustainable, that careers that are rewarding, that are healthy for you. So I hope, and this is one of the reasons that that they're in the film, the young people that were at the field day. I hope that people see it and they say, "Oh, look at that college student wearing boots, and who wants to be a farmer? Who wants to work on a farm?" I hope that people see it and say, "Oh, Thomas Mitchell is doing that work. I want to do that work too." He has an amazing and interesting story how he got into this work, and for the purpose of the film, we had to cut out his amazing story. But I hope people see the Eli family and say, "Hey," I hope people see PJ in a tractor. I was never in a tractor before this project, but I hope they see him and they say, "Hey man, that's interesting. Wait a minute, you could press a couple of buttons and actually just chill in the tractor for where the technology is going," you know? So I hope that the film just opens people's eyes to seeing Black people in rural spaces, in spaces they haven't seen, like PJ, people like Thomas, people like the Elis, and say, "Oh, wait a minute, I can identify that." And we're working, in terms of it getting out to the broad public, we're working on distribution and getting it out onto platform that everyone can see it. Because I think once everyone gets a hold of it and can see it, and from a personal anecdotal place, people have seen the film and said, "Oh, I need to check on my property," or "I want to get property." And even, just casually, following people on Twitter, and they hear about Heir's property, hear about this film. They're like, "I didn't know this was going on." And they get, moved. They're moved by the idea that this is happening, and so they want to do something about it. So hopefully, the exposure of all the different people and the issues and conversations inspires and initiates that thing in people to go, move and do something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just initiating these conversations, explaining some of these processes and procedures is so critical. I'll never forget, I was teaching a course several years ago, and I had a young student, and I was explaining Heir's property. I was talking about its role and its, the effects it has had. And she came up to me after class, this young African-American woman. She said, "I think that actually is describes my family's property." And this is in Louisa County, Virginia. And subsequent to that, she spent years working on this issue, both internally and also working to sort of draw attention to it, and now is thinking of going to law school to sort of pursue it even further. So I think, the more that we can actually get these conversations going, it's so critically important. So with that, actually, let's start by moving over to the Q&A portion of the forum. And please identify yourself and provide your university affiliation. And as a courtesy to others who are lined up, please ask one brief question. No speeches, please. And questions end with a question mark. And please note that we'll be using 4 stationary microphones throughout the audience for the question and answer session, 2 here on the first floor and 2 on the loge box level. So with that, we're ready to take any questions that the audience has. And I guess maybe while we're sort of waiting for folks to line up, actually we're ready to go now. So yes, great.
Hi, my name is Neha Sangera. I'm a public policy master's student at the Kennedy School. My question is for PJ. What do you think is the role of the USDA now in delivering economic justice to the Black farmer community? And as a Black farmer yourself, do you see the USDA as being a partner in bringing Black folks back into farming, or do you see them to be a continued impediment in that work?
Great question, and thank you for asking it. I think the USDA has a large role to play here. You know, USDA has a presence in every county, throughout every state, throughout the whole country. In my local counties, we farm, and we go to those local county offices and we report the acres of corn, the head of cattle. That local county office reports to the state office reports to Washington. The economists at USDA put all these supply and demand performance together, okay? That local county is where the rubber meets the road. The men and women that sit in those local county offices are the front row for the actions that they've employed against customers. This is where most of the discrimination is taking place. This is where most of the complaints have come from. And USDA has to do that part for the accountability that they have to hold their own employees accountable for when they wrong customers. And that's where USDA has the largest role to play. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes in the Justice for Black Farmers Act and the 2006, the financial relief for distressed borrowers. You know, farming is a very tough industry, and it requires a lot of capital and a lot of investment. And we are in an uncontrolled environment. It could have a drought, you could have a hurricane, and you have to be able to have safety measures around you to sustain in those tough years. And we just need to make sure that is very equitable as we shuffle the deck and everybody has the same level of support. In addition to those actions, the USDA subsidy programs. We've seen that in rural America, farmers in the South who have base acre allocations for higher paying crops in the Delta for Arkansas, where we're farming down there, if you have a cotton allotment, a base acre payment, or a rice base acre payment, you have a higher subsidy than a black farmer who wasn't privileged to have irrigation or grow those higher value crops. And what we're seeing is $100 per acre gap in payments between black landowners and white landowners side by side. So we're calling out the USDA and trying to say, hey, we've got to make this more equitable. Because for the last 30 years, if a white landowner's received $100 more per acre in subsidy payments, that's enough money to buy land, okay? So we've got to close those gaps. Thank you for your question.
Hello, thank you guys for doing this. My name is Hudson Bennett. I'm at the law school, Harvard Law School. I was wondering, this is a question for all of you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the more subtle consequences of the heirs property issues. So like you talk about how much capital is required to really move into commodity farming. And so I imagine the property, the legal issues around the property make it a little bit more difficult to get a loan so you can break into the commodity farming and stuff like that. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more, any of you, about some of the consequences that come from the property law issues.
I'm happy to share my experiences. Well, it also, clear title allows you control. So if I'm farming your family land and I go into that office to sign that land up and report that I planted corn or soybeans or rice on that farm, if you are not the proper landowner, that local individual in that county office can say, hey, PJ, this lease is not valid and you can't get crop insurance. You can't get a subsidy payment on that piece of property. And that really affects us financially. A lot of times if we're in an area where there's a disaster payment, you know, you could have a tornado come through, it could decimate a crop. Well, black farmers who don't have proper leases and control on that land don't get included in those payments as well. So it's a financial impact to those communities that don't have that structured correctly. I hope that helps it.
Should also add, this is not just a rural problem. This also affects urban residents. Yes. You know, this happened after Katrina in New Orleans. Yes. Many homeowners did not have clear title and were struggling to get access to FEMA relief as well. And this is, so many of the issues with heirs property transcend rural and urban problem.
Just to kind of add on it, just when you think about heirs property and you think about access to space, I always talk about land and I wanted to explore this conversation in the film from a spiritual and healing place. And with heirs property, the idea that someone far away from, connection to the land can sell, a portion of the land, you have to understand this is predatory. People go to these, the deed office, they look and see, oh, okay, this is where it ended. So now we just have to find the person that's far away. And imagine that, you have a house, and then all of a sudden someone's suing you, and you have to pay for your own house that you already have, but you don't have the money. In New York City, there was with all of by the way, this is happening in New York right now too, but in New York, there was a lot of gentrification going on when I was there. And there was a study that came out about the stress and anxiety that comes with losing your place to live. Now you're talking about losing something that's generational, 400 acres, 30 acres, whatever it is. Those effects they go beyond just the moment of, hey, the Eli's were scrambling to, what do we do? When you don't have access, do you have $50,000 just hanging around now for, some legal action that's coming upon you? Okay, most people don't. So it's that sort of thing. It's seeing your family go through that, the emotional conversation. And this is when Shirley talks about it, how they worked on this land and they had all these plans and then had to be taken away. What wasn't mentioned in the film was that Brother Sherrod went through depression for 9 to 10 years when they lost that land. 9 to 10 years when it didn't have to happen. These are the things, and this is why I wanted to show people, because the numbers say one thing, but when you see people that are actually dealing with it, it's another. People have land and you can't really monetize it. Like, these are the things when you talk about a kid going to college or not. You talk about 39 families, and that doesn't look like, this doesn't sound like a lot, right? It doesn't sound like, 39. But when you think about all the descendants of those people, all of the possibilities that are opened up for the people that have access to their land, whether they're farming, whether they create yoga spaces for people to come and heal, whatever it is is a domino and ripple effect that you can't even quantify it in some way, because there is intangible conversations, but that reverberate, that have very tangible, effects.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is the point that I was going to make. When you think about your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids' futures could all be eliminated as a result of that, right? And when you think about generational wealth around the country, generational wealth has been created through land ownership, right? That's been the primary source of generational wealth for many other, folks that we ourselves, right, Black communities, have not been able to access, right, for those generations. So every time I think about the fact that this construct of heirs property is literally eliminating progenies, families upon families, and you think about the emotional and the mental, the physical, the physiological toll that it has on others, it's pretty stark. It's pretty stark.
While the young man's standing, I was just going to say a little homework for you. We're here in Massachusetts, and I know there are commodity crops grown here in Massachusetts, corn and soybeans and others. And I don't know a Black commodity, a corn grower here in Massachusetts, a soybean grower in Massachusetts. Help prove me wrong, young man, and maybe you can find one, okay? But I don't know. And when you think about Black folks in the South and after slavery and sharecropping migrating north, but you look at some of the highest farmland values in the country, most of your Midwest I states, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, I've seen farmland sales for $15,000 and $20,000 an acre. Yet I cannot name you one black farmer in either one of those states that's a commodity grower producing corn or soybeans or wheat on a large scale. The other point I wanted to make is you have to think about the work that John Deere is doing here. Each one of those students and interns that are working in that environment, that investment in those students is planting a seed in those communities where those young men and women go back to. And they are there to spread that knowledge within their families, within their communities, their church communities, their civic organizations that they're a part of. And that rise in the tide will lift many boats, folks. Everybody can benefit from that. And what you're doing is you're opening up the ideas and the minds to a group of students who've never really been exposed to what I call the big green sexy. You know, when I get a young kid, you know, standing on the edge of a field, just waving at that big combine, I want to stop and bring them up in that cab with me. And I want them to, you know, and typically when I'm going down the field, I'm driving and the mom is out taking pictures and videos, all happy. But when I come back up the field, I let that kid drive. Now, granted that he's touching a button, let go on the wheel, but that kid, I'm investing that time because I want them to appreciate where the food came from on the dinner plate. And if we don't spend time to invest in our communities like that, who will? So, you know, because the thing is, folks, that we all have to eat every day. Agriculture is charged with feeding 7 billion people globally right now. By the year 2050, that's going to be 9 billion people. And with more buildings and infrastructure and asphalt and concrete, there's less and less soil to grow food on. And we are very fortunate to live in one of the most abundant, safe, and affordable food secure countries in the world. So we've got to reinvest in our own if we want to continue that.
So we have time for one last question. So would you like to?
Good evening. My name is Mansour Buffins. I'm a recent graduate from the School of Education. Thank y'all for being here. My question is coming from a place of like dreaming for repair. So y'all had mentioned how over time, over the past century, black landowners, black farmers have just decreased the number of acres that are owned by black people in this country from racist, explicitly racist or implicitly racist policies and practices. And so my question is, when you think about legislation or policies to reverse that trend and to increase the number of black people owning lands, becoming farmers, moving into commodity farming or even just farming in general, what are some policies, legislation that you think could be beneficial for black people in this country who want to repossess that land that has been dispossessed generations ago?
The one idea that I have is, finance controls a lot of things. The National Black Growers Council supported an initiative called a TIP program, Transition Incentive Program. If you are a Midwest farmer and you don't have any children and you have a few thousand acres of land and you're looking at either selling that to the neighbors that really don't like you and taking a capital gains chop off at the neck, if you could transition to a young beginning socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher, and the government would help offset the taxes and the capital gains and work out a program. That's an incentive that everybody would be interested in possibly because it helps put more money in those retirement accounts for those men and women that may not have a succession plan on the farm. And that's just one example. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think it's something that incentivizes that transition. So I call it a transition incentive program.
Also, I mentioned earlier about health and wellness. I would like to see policy and that would incentivize people to get land, help them get land to create spaces for health and wellness. I think particularly for black and brown folks, indigenous folks, I think that there is an idea that if you see somebody white doing yoga or you see somebody white in nature, it's not uncommon. It's not like, oh, wow, there's a white person in nature. But I think, when you talk about us, that there is. So I think that, and there are people who are doing it. I just want to be clear that there are a lot of people who are making that transition. There's a movement to go back to the South. There are a lot of black and brown folks going back to the South. I'm one of them. There's a movement for folks to get into land ownership, into farming, into sustainability, and things of that nature. But I also think that there does need to be grants and policies that help incentivize people doing that. For me and my taste, I love farming. If I got 400 acres of land, I'm probably not gonna farm it. I'm gonna call PJ. I'm being honest with you. But if any of that land I would take, it would definitely be to do some things that would increase and to promote the idea of health and wellness in those spaces.
So we'll have to end it there, but I want to thank all three of our panelists, and thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for the film. It's really, again, incredibly important, and thank you for everyone joining us here and online, and wonderful. Have a great night. So take care.